LSU has its next football coach. Lane Kiffin is headed to Baton Rouge. We've got everything you need to know. Locked on LSU. Here we go.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Okay, let's get it. It is Locked on LSU, your team every day. I'm your host, Matt Moscona. Thanks so much for making us your first listen. We're free, available wherever you get great podcasts. Of course, on YouTube as well. So please subscribe. As always, one of the fastest ways to help us grow is by leaving your comments below. So thank you sincerely for that. And thank you for helping make the Locked On Podcast Network the #1 sports podcast network in the world. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Well, after what feels like an eternity, Kiffin Watch is now over. Lane Kiffin is LSU's next head football coach. Through the course of this episode, I want to react to how this got done, fill you in on what I can, talk about staff, what this means for Ole Miss. And you might say, oh, Matt, this is an LSU podcast. Why do I care about Ole Miss? Well, Ole Miss is still an LSU rival that is going to be part of the annual opponent schedule. So what happens to Ole Miss is relevant because LSU is going to continue playing Ole Miss, and boy, is it a mess in Oxford. But let me start with a reaction at the base here. This is an amazing coup for LSU. Lane Kiffin has spent the last 6 years at Ole Miss in Oxford, and in the last 5 seasons has won 50 games. The only schools that won more games in the SEC during that time are Alabama and Georgia. So you are talking about a guy who, over the course of the last decade, has done wonders to rehab his image. From the youngest head coach in NFL history with the Raiders, as that flamed out, to then becoming a head coach at Tennessee, leaving after one season in sort of spectacular fashion, going to Southern Cal, being fired infamously on the tarmac, and then rehabbing his image as an analyst under Nick Saban in Alabama, then the offensive coordinator. Remember, of course, Nick Saban dismissed him before the national championship game because he was distracted as he was headed to FAU. He spent time at FAU where he had great success there as well before ultimately getting the Ole Miss job back in the big time, so to speak, at Ole Miss with the Rebels and leading Ole Miss over the last 6 seasons now to their first college football playoff appearance, and really an incredible run of success here at a place that had not had that in 6 decades. As a head coach, Lane Kiffin is 117-53. That's a .688 winning percentage. His one season at Tennessee, they were 7-6, but that was an amazing bounce back to get them above 500. In his time at SC from 2010 to 2013, it was deemed a failure, but he was 28-15, a .651 winning percentage. At FAU, 27-13, a .675 winning percentage. And then, of course, the last 6 seasons at Ole Miss, 55-19, a .743 winning percentage for Lane Kiffin during his time there in Oxford with the Rebels. But maybe more importantly than even that, the winning percentages, is the fact that LSU pulled off this coup in pulling away a head coach, a successful head coach, from a conference rival at a time where they're experiencing their most success in 60 years. And not just that, but a guy that is a brilliant offensive mind. Remember, LSU is coming off one of the worst offensive seasons in the history of the school. LSU finishes the regular season 108th in the country in scoring offense at just 22 points a game. They failed to score more than 25 against any FBS opponent. 123rd in rushing offense, 66th in passing offense. You are talking about one of the worst offenses in the history of LSU athletics, which is staggering to think. On the flip side, Ole Miss, 11th in the country in scoring at 37 points a game, and that's with Trinidad Chambliss, a Division II transfer at quarterback. 35th in the country at 188 rush yards per game, 3rd in the country in passing yards at 309. Everywhere Lane Kiffin has gone, offense has followed. So you check a box where you should immediately be better in 2026, where you were worse in 2025. I think it's also worth mentioning that you weakened a rival in Ole Miss. And I want to get some more on that in just a little bit, because, of course, you're going to be playing Ole Miss every year, and you do go to Oxford, by the way, in 2026, and what a scene that's going to be. I think it's also worth mentioning that Verge Ausberry deserves a hat tip. Let's not forget where LSU was a month ago. When Brian Kelly was fired, the governor made the inflammatory comments at that press conference. Scott Woodward was out a day later as he and LSU mutually agreed to part ways. And then Verge Ausberry was promoted as the interim. And he was tasked with hiring, as they said, the best coach in the country. And he went out and very clearly made that the emphasis and the focus of what they were going to do. And they quickly identified Lane Kiffin. And look, it wasn't easy throughout those first few days. Remember, President Wade Roos was introduced and then referred to Verge as the acting athletic director, only to quickly pivot. And they did install Verge as the full-time or permanent athletic director, however you want to phrase it. But all the while, Verge Ausberry has rewarded the faith, trust, confidence in him. And it's something we talked about when Verge was hired. There was maybe nobody within LSU athletics that was more qualified than Verge Ausberry. He spent a quarter century working in the LSU athletics department in darn near every role. He has been part of coaching hires in dozens of different coaching hires across many different sports, 4 different football hires, men's, women's basketball hires, baseball, softball, all of them. So he's been in those conversations, been in those meetings. He has relationships, and it's worth mentioning that Verge has a great relationship with Jimmy Sexton, Lane Kiffin's agent. Verge has a great relationship with Nick Saban. He told us on my radio show he has a standing call with Nick every 2 to 3 weeks. You don't think that it was something that the Friday after the Egg Bowl, when Lane Kiffin's sitting in that press conference and he says that he's going to go seek the consult of Coach Carroll and Coach Saban, what do you think Nick Saban was telling him? Nick Saban sits there on College Game Day, by the way, after the Egg Bowl the next day, and he's asked his opinion on the whole Lane Kiffin thing. And remember, this is what Nick Saban said on game day, the day after the Egg Bowl, when all this was at its fever pitch.
I think they should let Lane coach his team, number one. But I think Lane's decision is going to come down to one thing, and that thing is just what Marty said. Where is the place that I can recruit the best players? And I think, one of Lane's apprehensions is he's had to use the portal to build his team at Ole Miss each year. And at LSU, he probably could recruit better talent and then just supplement his team by need with the portal. And that's probably the dilemma that he has, as well as his loyalty to his team that he's coaching now, that he wants to be able to continue to coach. So it's a tough thing to have the right answer to.
Think about what Nick just said there, where he can go to recruit the best players and not have to use the portal every year. And he thinks that's LSU. What do you think Nick was telling? He said that on College Game Day. What do you think Nick was telling Lane Kiffin privately? A big part of how Lane Kiffin and LSU ended up linking up together was Jimmy Sexton, was Nick Saban, were these confidants of Lane Kiffin's early in this process, steering him toward LSU and away from Florida, which is a big part of how this landed. So Verge Ausberry deserves a ton of credit. He has aced his first test. And by the way this came together so stealthily is another part of how they were able to get it done. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the contract, the structure, the buyouts, why ultimately Lane picked LSU. We'll get into all of that as we continue here on a jam-packed edition of Locked on LSU, your team every day. The World Cup is coming back to North America for the first time since 1994. And with 48 teams for the first time ever, it's going to be massive. But let's be honest, getting tickets is usually the hardest part. That's why the Gametime app is clutch. Finally, giving fans a real advantage when it comes to snagging seats. With Gametime, you can track price drops in real time, get alerts when great seats open, and buy tickets the moment they hit the app. It puts the power back in your hands, and it makes going to the World Cup realistic instead of impossible. Look, you pull up the app, and the layout makes it so simple to scroll through matchups and compare seat views. Pick a game, tap a section, and have your tickets locked within minutes. No confusion, no hunting for fine print. Take the guesswork out of buying World Cup tickets. Every match, concert, or event with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, download the app, make an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go, Gametime. So how did LSU get across the finish line with Lane Kiffin? We do have a lot we're going to talk about how messy it got near the end with Ole Miss, why ultimately Lane picked LSU, the staff, and a lot of the things people are interested in. But if you're an everydayer, thank you and shout out. And we've followed through this here for several weeks now. Early in LSU's process, they clearly identified Lane Kiffin as their top target. But the wheels really started to get into motion about 2 weeks ago. You remember there was that Monday when Layla Kiffin visited Baton Rouge. Well, the Thursday before that is when, so 3 days prior, 4 days prior, is when that trip was scheduled. And that was when, at that point, Florida was very much in the lead for Lane Kiffin. I would go so far as to say that maybe Florida even had some verbal understanding with Lane that he was going to be the coach. Only when LSU began their pursuit of Lane Kiffin in earnest through Jimmy Sexton, again, who has a great relationship with Verge Ausberry and brokered the deal for Nick Saban back 25 years ago, only then did LSU really start to get in the mix for Lane Kiffin. And as that week transpired, everything started to fall into place. Layla Kiffin, Angela Kiffin, who's Chris Kiffin's wife, along with Angela and Chris's two youngest children, made the trip to Baton Rouge that Monday. From that point, LSU did everything right, dotting every I, crossing every T, from talking about different areas to live, working out terms of the contract, even having conversations with LHSAA representatives about Knox Kiffin's eligibility to make sure that where they lived, he'd be eligible immediately wherever he was transferring in. LSU did everything right throughout this entire process. So as that week started to go along, more and more of the feeling started trending toward LSU and away from Florida. And by the time Friday of that week, and this was the Friday before the Egg Bowl, Black Friday, the Friday prior, when LSU's Board of Supervisors held that meeting in executive session, when Brian Kelly's buyout was on the publicly released agenda, when they went into executive session, have it on good authority that part of what they discussed, of course, was the terms of the contract they were going to offer Lane Kiffin. And Friday night is when the terms of that contract leaked to Ross Dellinger. And at that point, Lane Kiffin and LSU had a verbal agreement. They didn't have anything signed. Maybe you had an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, but that's effectively a term sheet, and that's not legally binding. But at that point, that Friday, is when LSU had really taken the lead. They had the terms of the contract agreed upon. They had a verbal from Lane or Lane's representatives that he was coming. And then it was just about waiting out a week where you hoped Lane didn't get cold feet, where you hoped maybe the emotion of coaching his team and his desire to coach in the playoff didn't overwhelm his desire to leave. And of course, it was a holiday week and they played on a Friday. And so the concern, I think, for many in the LSU camp was, could Lane Kiffin be sitting there in that post-game press conference after the Egg Bowl, punching a ticket to the college football playoff, 11-win season, greatest season in the history of the state of Mississippi, and say, you know what am I doing? Of course I'm staying. When that didn't happen, all the confidence shifted back toward LSU. Now, the other thing that very clearly, by contrast of how Ole Miss handled this, that served LSU well, was the fact that LSU was willing to be patient and wait on Lane Kiffin's timeline. Remember, Verge Ausberry told us on my radio show that Tuesday after he was hired. The first interview Verge Ausberry did was on my radio show and said, when I asked him point blank, would you be willing to wait through the end of the college football playoff for the right candidate? And he said they would. And they expressed that early in the process to Lane. So a very clear negotiating tactic that LSU used here, a bargaining chip, a leverage play, was not to pressure Lane Kiffin, was not to make him feel like he had to make a decision or they were going to move on, because that could have pushed him to Florida or back to Ole Miss. But LSU said, coach the playoff. I'm not breaking any news. Verge Ausberry said it on my show. They told Lane Kiffin, you can coach the playoff. We'll wait to the end of the playoff, which meant potentially missing the December signing period, missing the January transfer portal window. But what they were doing was not pressuring Lane Kiffin into a decision and allowing him to do it on his timeline, very clearly identifying, you're our guy, you're our number one choice. We'll wait for you on your timeline. Coach your team. We'll be here when you're ready. And to do that without a binding agreement is a real risk, because remember, LSU didn't have a great backup option. Their backup option throughout the process was Eli Drinkwitz. Well, Eli Drinkwitz ultimately agreed to a deal to extend and stay at Missouri. Clark Lee got an extension at Vanderbilt, who, by the way, is also represented by Jimmy Sexton. You look around. John Sumrall started to engage with Florida, where ultimately he took that job. Alex Golish had other interests. You look around and you realize, man, your options are dwindling if Kiffin backs out. So they were all in on Lane and had to play their cards just right to make sure they got him. But they also had to feel like the interest from Lane was real and sincere from the beginning, which clearly it was, and that's how they were able to get this done. So now look at the contrast of what happened with Ole Miss. Ole Miss made a mess of this whole thing to where the Saturday after the Egg Bowl got very contentious there. And it's left Ole Miss in a bind. I'm going to go deeper into that to wrap up the show, so I'll come back to that. So I don't want to lose, but just look at the contrast of how LSU handled it and how Ole Miss handled the entire situation. Now, the contract is another part of this. Ross Dellinger reported 7 years, $90 million. As we've explained in a previous episode, and if you missed it, I would highly recommend you go back, scroll back to last weekend, and find the show that we did where we talked about the contract with the contract details link. Because not only did I talk about the structure of the deal, but also went into deep detail about how LSU plans to take care of the NIL promises that they made to Lane Kiffin. But there's a couple of key things. Remember, the governor made the comment about how they weren't going to offer some giant contract with the big buyout. Well, a $90 million contract is massive. But as I understand it, of course, Ross said the 7 years, $90 million. You're talking about a base in the neighborhood of $12 million a year, which would make Lane Kiffin among the highest paid coaches in the country. But the bonus structure therein is sort of like an NFL bonus structure. There are likely to be earned bonuses and not likely to be earned bonuses, meaning if you achieve great success, like make the playoff, win a championship, you're going to have massive escalators that'll pay you more, which I think we can all agree with. You win a championship, yeah, pay him for that. The buyout structure, though, I think is also fascinating, as it's been explained to me. And whenever we get the contract and it becomes public record, we'll be able to sift through it a bit more to get some more finality to this. But as I understand the way they've structured the buyout is that the more Lane wins, the buyout remains high. If he starts to lose, the buyout drops. So you get protection from a massive buyout for a coach that's losing. And Lane, of course, thinking he's coming here to win, would be okay with that. And it's a little bit of a quid pro quo. You give a little, I give a little. So LSU maybe gets a little relief on the buyout, but Lane has the bigger salary with bonus structure that can allow him to get to north of 13, 14, 15, $16 million a year with the bonuses, depending on how all those may kick in. So he has the possibility, if he wins, to be the highest paid coach in the country by a lot. But also LSU has the protection that if it doesn't work, the buyout won't crater them the way that this Brian Kelly $54 million buyout will. So I think it's very smart. I want to give a hat tip again to the people on this search committee, because it's something we explained. You may look at having guys like Scott Ballard and John Carmouche from the Board of Supervisors, EJ Kuiper from FMOL, Ben Bordelon from Bollinger and say, well, these aren't football. Ben Bordelon played at LSU, but these aren't football guys. Why would they be on the coaching committee search? I understand that. Verge can handle that. And you could certainly have confidence in who you're leaning on. And like Nick Saban would say, hey, you go hire Lane Kiffin. But those men are very smart business people who run gigantic companies who negotiate $1 million contracts every day. So how do you structure something? How do you handle yourself at that negotiating table, knowing when to push, when to give? Like, all of that matters so much. And it's how they were able to get this done and a deal done that it's going to be a big dollar amount, but it's something that's palatable for both sides. It's exciting for Kiffin and it's doable for LSU. So all of those things really fall into place. So major coup for Verge Ausberry and this committee who handled this brilliantly. The contract, the way they've structured it, looks really good. What's next now is the staff, which everyone's going to ask about, and then also what this means for Ole Miss. We'll get to that here as we roll along. It's Locked on LSU, your team every day. The holidays always feel a little easier when you already know the perfect gift. And Omaha Steaks makes it almost too simple. Whether you're treating yourself this season or sending something memorable to family and friends, Omaha Steaks delivers handcrafted perfection right to their door. And this week is the best time to jump in because their cyber sale is here and the deals are huge. The quality, it's exactly what you hope for. Incredibly tender steaks, rich flavor, and meals that make hosting or weeknight cooking easier. And the variety is underrated. There's steaks, burgers, comfort meals, sides, desserts. It's one of those gifts that truly fits anyone. Save big on unforgettable gifts with Omaha Steaks. Visit omahasteaks.com for 50% off site-wide and an extra 20% off select favorites during their cyber sale. And for an additional $35 off, use promo code COLLEGE at checkout. That's omahasteaks.com, promo code COLLEGE. Terms apply. See site for details. Thank you once again for helping make the Locked On Podcast Network the #1 sports podcast network in the world. We're excited to be here, especially on this day where LSU has their next football coach, and it is Lane Kiffin. Now, one of the big things that everyone has asked is, why would he leave Ole Miss for LSU, and who's he bringing with him? Well, the why he would leave Ole Miss for LSU is not meant to be shaded LSU at Ole Miss, but it's just a reality. And it's something that after Ole Miss played Florida a few weeks ago, we talked about. That was a day where Ole Miss had 68,000 people in the stands. It was the largest crowd in the history of Vaught-Hemingway Stadium, the largest crowd in the history of Ole Miss football. On the same day, LSU at 5-4 played 2-7 Arkansas at 11:45 in the morning and had more people in the stands than Ole Miss did on their greatest day in the history of the program. The two are just not the same. The other thing, and you heard Nick Saban say it in that bite we played. The other thing, as I've said and have said every day, or as you've heard me say this a couple of times here now, Lane Kiffin has been fearful that with the new era of NIL with revenue share, that things are going to revert to the blue bloods, to revert the way they were before NIL. Let me explain. In the NIL era, when NIL has become pay for play, the Grove Collective could go raise $25 million for a roster. They could plop it on a table and say, go spend it. You could write a $200,000 check to buy a backup offensive lineman. You could spend $3 million on a quarterback if you wanted. Anybody could do it. It's how Ole Miss and Texas Tech and SMU, historic also-rans, became nationally relevant. Indiana. Well, in the revenue share era, where you have to have now true third-party NIL, where every NIL deal over $600 has to go through the clearinghouse and be approved, it doesn't matter a lick. If your boosters put $25, $40 million on the table, the question is, how do you get that money through the clearinghouse? How do you get that approved to get it to your athletes? Well, you have to have legitimate brand deals that can be done. So ask yourself this: what's a bigger brand, LSU or Ole Miss? And again, it's not shaded Ole Miss, but Olivia Dunn and Angel Reese on the cover of Sports Illustrated, that's LSU brand. When you think about Paul Skeens and Olivia Dunn as a couple, that's brand. Paul Skeens just won the Cy Young. Joe Burrow, Jaden Daniels winning Heisman trophies. Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson. My goodness, that's LSU's brand. Shaquille O'Neal still carries LSU's brand. Even in non-revenue sports, think about Lolo Jones, Mondo Duplantis, Sha'Carri Richardson. These are all LSU athletes. Think about Ryan Clark and Marcus Spears and Booger McFarland on TV every single day. That's LSU brand. LSU has brand that you can sell, that brands want to be a part of. And so with the Go Collective, with the NILSU Max program that LSU put in through Playfly, they have been negotiating these brand deals with LSU athletes to funnel legitimate NIL into the athletic department. And LSU has worked for 18 months before this went into effect to get all of these ducks in a row. So LSU's strategy, their plan, on top of their brand, has allowed this to be a thing where you're going to be able to continue to thrive. And then all the things that have always been historically significant: the great stadium, the loyal fan base, the only Power Five in a talent-rich state, all the Louisiana kids that want to play at LSU. I mean, Lamar Brown is the number one player in the country. He's on LSU's campus. Richard Anderson's a 5-star defensive lineman committed to LSU. He's at Edna Carr an hour down the road. I mean, you could just go through the list and you understand. Easton Royal, the number one receiver in the country for 2027, who just committed to Texas, but he's at Brother Martin in New Orleans. You don't think Lane Kiffin's going to go get in the mix there? So again, I mean, you think about Elijah Haven at the Dunham School, number one quarterback in the country for 2027. I know LSU's got a commitment from Peyton Houston. We'll see if that holds. But the point being, there's so many reasons why LSU's brand elevates it to a point where you can make, Lane Kiffin's proven, you can make the playoff, the 12-team playoff at Ole Miss. But can you win a championship and consistently compete for and win championships? Or is just making a 12-team playoff in a one-off your ceiling? It feels like for Kiffin, he thought the ceiling was lower at Ole Miss and certainly higher at LSU. And that's ultimately why he's now the coach at LSU. So the big question now becomes, who's coming with him? This is going to be really interesting because as the day has transpired, as we record here on Sunday, there's reports that Lane Kiffin plans to bring the bulk of his offensive staff with him. As I understand it, Charlie Weiss Jr., his offensive coordinator, Kevin Smith, his running backs coach, becoming as well. Another interesting name to know is James Craig. Remember, James Craig was the offensive line coach for LSU during the national championship in 2019. Craig was on staff at SC with Ed Ogeron and Lane Kiffin. Well, remember, Craig was fired for cause at LSU as part of a recruiting thing around the COVID year, saying like he was giving swag and talking to recruits when there was non-contact periods during COVID. He ended up becoming a scapegoat. He filed suit and ultimately won that lawsuit as well. But as I understand, it's water under the bridge. It's a different athletic administration, and Lane Kiffin wants him. James Craig will be back in Baton Rouge. The most interesting person on the offensive staff is, of course, going to be Frank Wilson. Now, Frank, remember, worked at Tennessee under Lane Kiffin in 2009. He did not go to SC with Kiffin in 2010. Instead, Les Miles hired Frank at LSU that year. So, listen, Frank Wilson has done an incredible job of keeping this recruiting class together and this roster together here as the interim head coach. So retaining Frank would feel paramount, but Lane Kiffin's going to want to bring Kevin Smith with him. Smith is the former Central Florida running back who played, in the NFL as well, and has been with Kiffin from his time at FAU now through 6 years at Ole Miss as well. So Kiffin's going to want to bring Kevin Smith. How do they manipulate those roles on staff? I don't have that answer today, but it would greatly behoove Lane Kiffin to retain Frank Wilson. We can all understand that. I'm certain that's going to be expressed to him, but they got to find a way to make that work, those roles work. I'm not sure that anybody else on the offensive staff would be retained. And quite honestly, after this season offensively, would you retain anybody on that offensive staff? If Lane Kiffin wants to overhaul it all and bring in his guys, it makes total sense. There was a report from Matt Hayes that Ole Miss staffers were told, if you're not planning on staying, then leave now. And they won't be with Ole Miss during the college football playoff. So it looks like that will happen where almost the entirety of Lane Kiffin's offensive staff will be coming. The most interesting storyline that's transpired is what's happening defensively, though, because throughout this entire process, the widely reported assumption, we've talked about it here. Every national outlet had it on Saturday, was that Joe Judge was going to be promoted to the interim coach at Ole Miss when Kiffin left. Instead, it now looks like Pete Golding, the defensive coordinator, is going to be promoted to the interim coach with a possibility of being named the full-time head coach. Now, as I record this on Sunday early afternoon, nothing has been finalized there. But I think that speaks to a couple of things that are very relevant for LSU. Remember, Pete Golding was on staff with Lane Kiffin at Alabama. When Lane got the Ole Miss job, he brought Pete there with him to be his defensive coordinator. Pete Golding is from Hammond. And I will tell you now that a week and a half ago, I had conversations in agent circles that Pete Golding was making preliminary phone calls about potential staffers that would be willing to join their defensive staff in Baton Rouge. So there was a point in this process a week and a half ago where Pete Golding was at least considering joining Lane Kiffin in Baton Rouge, if not likely to do so. I think what's happened over the last 36 hours has probably shifted that. So, but given the fact that Golding looks like he is staying at Ole Miss, that opens up the door for Blake Baker to stay in Baton Rouge, which I think most everyone would be very excited about. As a matter of fact, it sounds like almost the entire defensive staff is going to be retained. Blake Baker, Kevin Peoples, Jake Olson. It will be interesting what happens with Kyle Williams, because I've heard some scuttle that maybe this 1 year has made Kyle wonder if he wants to continue at LSU. So I don't know the answer to that, but when your first year in coaching is as tumultuous as this, the coach gets fired and everything that's happened, maybe Kyle Williams doesn't want to continue to pursue this. Worth mentioning, a lot of people have brought up Ed Ogeron. I have not had a conversation with anyone at LSU okaying Ed Ogeron's return. I know Matt Zenitz at CBS had a report that LSU would be okay with it, but don't know if that was sources from LSU or agent sources close to Ogeron saying, yeah, LSU would be okay with it. Again, that report didn't specify. I've given you my opinion on this in a previous episode as well, which is that if Ed Ogeron wants to humble himself and return to a place where he was the head coach and was fired and can return as an assistant, it would be incredible. He still has his home in Baton Rouge, has love for the Tigers. He still says go Tigers all the time. And he's an incredible defensive line coach. He's an incredible recruiter, has a great relationship with Lane Kiffin. I mean, 10 out of 10 co-sign. That would be amazing to get Ed Ogeron back on staff, provided he's okay with it. And I've given you this analogy before. It's the John Quincy Adams analogy. John Quincy Adams, you may know, is a former president, but he holds a unique distinction. John Quincy Adams is the only U.S. president who, after his presidential term expired, went back and served in Congress, which he did for 17 years until his death, because he wanted to continue serving his country. And so he humbled himself, having been in the highest office, and went back into Congress. So in essence, if Ed Ogeron could walk into football ops and not go up to that elevator to the second floor office, the corner with the big balcony, and know someone else is in that office that he used to occupy, okay. If he can do that and go coach ball and be a great defensive line coach, would love to see that. But again, I don't have anything further that I could share on that as of this point. The other person that I get asked about most often is GM Austin Thomas. And a lot of times people have drawn the comparison, the parallel, knowing that Austin Thomas had been at Ole Miss with Lane Kiffin and thought, oh, look, they know each other. I don't get the sense that Austin Thomas leaving Ole Miss happened on good terms. And I've heard that plenty from both sides, both people at LSU and at Ole Miss. Now, I want to be clear. I think the world of Austin Thomas. I think he's a brilliant guy. And in this era, has done amazing work. A few years ago when they went up to Seattle and sort of shadowed the Seattle Seahawks organization to bring back some of their models of how they manage salary cap and expenditures and roster and all that. It's amazing. He's a very forward-thinking guy and has been during each of his stints at LSU. I think the world of Austin Thomas would love for him to stay. I just don't think that seems like a realistic possibility. So Billy Glasscock is Lane Kiffin's GM at Ole Miss. And everything that I've been told is that Glasscock will be joining Lane Kiffin's staff in Baton Rouge. Now, he's got a long history. Prior to being with Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, he was at Texas as their director of player personnel for 3 seasons. Before that, he was a player personnel guy at Texas, at NC State, at Northern Illinois. Prior to that, Arizona Western back in 2008, and at Joliet Junior College from 2002 to 2007 as an assistant. So you talk about a guy that has worked his way all the way up from his time in JUCO and from 02 to 07, all the way up through the ranks from the mid-majors to NC State to Texas, and then the GM there at Ole Miss under Lane Kiffin. And Lane Kiffin thinks the world of him, thinks he's very forward-thinking, smart guy, and Billy Glasscock will be joining Lane Kiffin's staff as well as the general manager at LSU. And that really weakens Ole Miss even further, which is how we'll kind of wrap this up. The last few days at Ole Miss have been tumultuous. And you've seen a lot of the reports about how ugly this ending was. Now, the meeting that was to happen Saturday between Lane Kiffin and athletic director Keith Carter and their chancellor, Glenn Boyce, was supposed to happen early in the day and was supposed to be a relatively quick meeting. It did not become that. It happened at 3:00 and ended up being a 4-hour meeting that I was told became very contentious. And there are reports out there that there were even threats of gutting staffs and players opting out. Now, I'm not at a point where I would use the word threats. I don't know that I'm comfortable saying that Lane Kiffin threatened anything along those lines. But what is very clear is that Ole Miss has been looking at it from the perspective of they're about to play in the college football playoff. Their coach is leaving and taking staff with them. So how do they dismiss Lane Kiffin, but keep staff members that are ultimately going to be recruiting for and working for Lane Kiffin in Baton Rouge? So the report from Matt Hayes was that if you're not staying with us, then if you're going, then get out now. What that's done is it's severely weakened Ole Miss's staff. As they're going to be preparing for the college football playoff now, not only will they not have Lane Kiffin, they won't have Charlie Weiss Jr. or Kevin Smith or their offensive staff that's all coming with Lane Kiffin to Baton Rouge. So who coaches Ole Miss's offense in the college football playoff? It's a giant question. It's a gigantic question at this point. It's an unknown. On top of that, I have been told that there are some players that while there's a lot of players at Ole Miss that are very upset with Lane Kiffin for leaving, there are some players on that roster that are loyal to Lane Kiffin. 3 maybe primary among them: quarterback Trinidad Chambliss, running back Kewan Lacey, and wide receiver Winston Watkins. Those are 3 that I would say keep an eye on, that when the portal opens in January, to see if they don't enter the transfer portal as guys that could very well end up in Baton Rouge at LSU joining Lane Kiffin. There's likely to be more. Those are just 3 specific names I was told on Sunday from people within Ole Miss that I trust, that have a good finger on the pulse of this, that are loyal to Lane Kiffin, that don't be surprised if they enter the transfer portal. Again, Chambliss. Now, Chambliss has to go through an appeals process to get another year of eligibility. Lacey's a terrific running back. And then, of course, Watkins is a fantastic receiver. But I think what you can draw from this is how the two sides contrast and how they handled this. LSU was very patient. They were very stealth-like. You didn't hear anything publicly from Verge Ausberry or any member of that committee. From the time Verge Ausberry did the interview on my radio show, I don't know if Verge gave another interview publicly after that day. And nobody on the committee spoke publicly at any point throughout this. So LSU dealt in stealth mode. There's an old saying, loose lips sink ships. And I think LSU is very conscious and aware of that. The flip side is look at how Ole Miss handled Lane Kiffin. The unawareness by their athletic director, Keith Carter, that Kiffin was leaving. And it's very clear all along. When for 2 months you have a contract extension on your desk and you don't sign it, and your ex-wife and your family is flying to different cities and you refuse to commit, it's very clear he was leaving. To me and to you and to everybody, it was clear that he was leaving. But Keith Carter didn't build himself a safety net. He never got on a plane and flew to New Orleans to go talk to John Summerall to really recruit him. At any point, Keith Carter could have said to Lane Kiffin, this is done. You are with us or you are leaving the side because we can't proceed like this. But he never did. He had the opportunity, but just like Lane Kiffin wanted to have his cake and eat it too, Lane Kiffin wanted to take the LSU job and also wanted to continue coaching his team. Keith Carter also didn't want to sabotage the best season in Ole Miss history. He wanted to win the Egg Bowl. He wanted to potentially win the SEC championship if they got there. Lane Kiffin gave him the best opportunity to do that. But, well, that might have been what was in the best interest for that game. Look at where it has left the Ole Miss program. Because Ole Miss didn't go pursue other candidates, because Keith Carter was continuing to maybe try to massage and sort of placate Lane Kiffin, hoping that he'd have a change of heart and stay. The game of musical chairs was playing. The music stopped. Everyone had a coach except Ole Miss. John Summerall's at Florida. Alex Golesh is at Auburn. Ryan Silverfield is at Arkansas. Lane Kiffin's at LSU. Meanwhile, Ole Miss is scrambling to promote an assistant who wasn't even a consideration in an effort, because he's popular, to try to keep the thing together for this playoff run, and might even hire him on a full-time basis because they're out of options. It is a case in point of how to handle one of these searches and how not to handle one of these searches. And Verge Ausberry gets a 10 out of 10 because he aced the test. And not only did you land the biggest fish in the pond, but you also weakened a rival that's on your schedule every single year, by the way, who beat you this year. And next fall, LSU is scheduled to go back to Oxford. And my goodness, if you thought the 2008 game where Nick Saban came to Baton Rouge as the Alabama coach for the first time was toxic and hate-filled, this will be that on every bit of steroids you can imagine. Because Nick had a trip to the NFL, which LSU fans understood. They hated when he came back into the SEC. But leaving for the NFL was something LSU fans understood. Lane Kiffin leaving Ole Miss this way in the middle of their playoff run to go to who Ole Miss feels is their most hated rival. Oh my goodness. Theater unlike we have ever seen next fall in Oxford. But LSU will have Lane Kiffin in purple and gold on the LSU sideline. LSU has hired Lane Kiffin as their new football coach. When we have details about the introductory press conferences, I'm told it's supposed to be Monday at the Lawton Room in Tiger Stadium. We'll certainly talk about it and let you hear everything LSU's new coach has to say when he is formally introduced by the Tigers. And of course, we'll be here on Locked on LSU. Hey, thanks so much for making us your first listen. If you're on podcast, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app, rate us, leave a review. If you're on YouTube, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you're notified whenever we post a new video. And let a friend know if they love the Tigers. We got you here every single day. It's Locked on LSU, your team every day.